My name is Laura Justice. I'm the Executive Director of the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. We're a research center in the College of Education and Human Ecology. And before we move to our main event, which we're personally very excited about, I wanted to just use this opportunity to share with you a little bit about the Crane Center and our role on campus, which is largely to stimulate high-quality research and influence practices and policies that enhance the well-being of children. Many of you in this room, I'm sure you're all affiliated with OSU in some way, either as a patriot to our football team or a researcher on campus. There's lots and lots of ways to get involved in the Crane Center. I wanted to share with you some of the activities in which we're engaged. The first one you see up here is our Spring Distinguished Speaker event. Dr. Ellen Bialystock is our first ever Spring Distinguished Speaker. We're very excited about that. And we hope that this will be a recurring event. So after today, if you have feedback, we want this to be a great event that welcomes many people here. We'll have the main event here for the next hour, and then we'll move to this room for a reception afterwards. We also will have a fall thematic symposium on children. This year it'll be October 10th. This is a thematic offering, and this year the offering it's on the state of pre-K. And so we'll be bringing in 3 nationally recognized scholars who study pre-K, and that's in the works right now. It'll be a full afternoon followed by a reception. So I really hope a lot of you would come to that. We have a monthly colloquia, and there's materials about that. We'll be setting up our schedule for next year, and I'd love to hear suggestions of amazing people in our community that we ought to spotlight. We're also invested in the Schoenbaum Family Center in terms of guiding its research. I won't tell you anything about that right now, except to direct you towards resources that are print materials that are available on the table outside that describe for you opportunities to engage in research at the Schoenbaum Family Center. We have a lot of workshops. We have a student-led writing group. We have white papers. The most recent one is available up front. We have training programs for postdocs and pre-docs. And importantly, I also wanted to point out that we'll be offering faculty and student research grants with a RFA due in September. So I'll ask that you think about checking in regularly on our website. I put it below. You can just search OSU to stay abreast of things like these grant opportunities and other activities that'll be coming about. We really want to use our center as a way to involve people across the campus in research that's focused on children's well-being. Without further ado, I'm so happy to welcome Ellen Bialystock. Dr. Bialystock is a distinguished research professor at York University in Toronto, Canada. As you know, she was supposed to be here a few weeks ago, and due to unforeseen circumstances, we rescheduled. And we're so happy that she was able to work with us to reschedule this and that all of you came out. I consider Dr. Bialystock the nation, if not world's, leading scholar in the area of bilingualism, particularly cognitive advantages induced by being bilingual, and I know you're going to be talking about that today. She's received numerous awards. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed research articles. She's written several critical textbooks like Lifespan Cognition, Mechanisms of Change, published by Oxford University Press. So we will give her a huge Ohio welcome, and she will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer followed by a reception so you can sort of grab her and share with her your own experiences with something you want to share with her about. So let's welcome Ellen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laura. And I want to thank everybody who was involved in my cancellation and rescheduling. Everybody was just as kind and as helpful as they could be, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. I've given a lot of talks. This is the first time I've spoken in a cartoon room. Interesting. I've decided to give you an overview of the whole program of research I'm involved in, but the whole middle chunk is going to be mostly about kids because that speaks mostly to what the majority of you do. But I say that because I want you to think about this as a program of research. It isn't a bunch of studies with kids and a bunch of studies with young adults and so forth. It's really about the common themes that I will try to explain. And this is the main one. It's about experience. You are what you eat. Everything you do has some impact on the structure or function of your brain, on the cognitive processes you engage in, on the knowledge you accumulate. And if you put it that way, it doesn't sound radical or surprising. You probably are nodding. I see a lot of you say, yeah, well, sure. You accumulate experience with the intention of it having some effect. And yet people are surprised when I say being bilingual changes the way your mind and brain work. So the argument I want to frame this around is neuroplasticity. So we know video game players develop speeded skill at certain perceptual motor, perceptual cognitive processes and activities. London taxi drivers famously have expanded areas in part of the hippocampus that's responsible for spatial navigation because that's what they do. So these are examples of function and brain function and brain structure. I forgot I had this fancy thing. Okay, but where do I? Nice, okay. That change the structure or function of your mind. And so the central concept for my talk is neuroplasticity, defined here by Brian Kolb as persistent change in behavior from experience mediated by reorganization of blah, blah. It sounds boring, right? What it means is that experience changes the way your brain works, and that's what's important. Now, if I step away, does this microphone actually carry it? They say no. No, okay. All right, so I'm stuck, okay. Now, if that's true, we can use experience not only as something that varies naturally in the world, but as an intervention. And here's a couple of examples. There's a neurologist in Alabama, Edward Taub, who developed a system called constraint-induced movement therapy. And the idea is bizarre. So you get a stroke in the left part of your brain that knocks out all possibility of moving your right arm. And there's nothing you can do about it because you have tissue damage. So here's what he does. He comes in and says, all right, you're totally paralyzed in your right arm. The motor area controlling that set of muscles is damaged. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bind your left arm, the good one, the one that works. And you say, that's my only arm. He said, trust me. And over time, it forces the rewiring of all those neural circuits. Now, the brain tissue that was damaged by the stroke doesn't come back. But this is neuroplasticity. Other pathways are found. So this is what I mean by functional rewiring. There's a lot of evidence from animal models. So there's a really, I find, interesting body of research that shows if you take rats and you compare raising them in, these standard lab rat cages with these kind of Disney-esque cages, and some of these become really elaborate. They have, lights and toys and female rats for the little boy rats and all that stuff. Those rats grow up to be smarter in rat terms. They learn to run mazes better. So again, the argument is that their brains are being rewired by experience. So what I'm hoping to convince you of is that this is a perfectly normal outcome of engaging in certain kinds of experiences. So the question for today is whether bilingualism also contributes to neuroplasticity. But we start with a methodological problem. In most research, like the rats, you can put one group of rats in a simple cage and one group of rats in an elaborated cage, and then you compare how they do. You have two groups, it's categorical, and you know which cage each rat was raised in. But bilingualism isn't like that. It's not categorical. It's a dimension, a continuum across which there is immense incremental variability. No two bilingual experiences are the same, and no two bilinguals are the same. So what do we mean by bilingual? How do we even begin to research the effect of a concept that has no grounding? Well, we know what the endpoints are. So we know what bilingual means. That's the two-headed monster, two different heads, two different brains. You can say two things two different ways. And that's pretty clear. And we also think we know what monolingual means. It means something like that. You don't even understand that other words could exist, because why should they have to? But most of the action is actually in the middle. And in a couple of the studies, maybe just one, can't remember, that I'm talking about, I'm going to try to deal with what happens in this middle point where people are somewhere in the gray zone, some on this continuum. Now, in the studies that I'm going to show you, where we actually have two groups that we compare, we're very careful in our lab to select as much as possible from what we would consider to be the endpoints, and we avoid this gray area. And that's because we want our contrasts, our comparisons, to be as clear as possible. Okay, so here's the story. This slide will tell the entire story that I'm going to try to then just elaborate with examples. In a bilingual mind, well, in any mind, language is represented in some structured way. And for a bilingual, there'll be two of these interacting systems. The key point is that for bilingual, both languages are always active. There isn't a language switch. So the mental landscape of a bilingual mind includes two overlapping systems competing for attention. Well, if that would be the case, why isn't there confusion? Why doesn't a bilingual frequently come out with the name of something in the wrong language? Because in this model, this kind of shared activation in the rapidity of online speech processing should lead to massive confusion and intrusion. It doesn't happen. And the argument, the central hypothesis, is that it doesn't happen because the executive control system is brought in to focus attention and manage the conflict. All right, the implications. First, that configuration leads to reduced representations of each language compared to a monolingual speaker of that language. And because of this joint activation, in general, language processing is just more effortful. There's just more going on. These representations are overlapping, they're conflicting, they're not as elaborated. So all language processing for a bilingual is more effortful than it is for a monolingual. But because both languages are always active, the executive control system, which is a domain general set of cognitive processes, is brought in and included in language processing to monitor and select attention so that the correct language is being used. The constant recruitment of that executive control system both changes and strengthens it. So the entire executive control system for a bilingual is different after a lifetime of bilingualism. It's not the same system that monolinguals have. And happily, it's a better system. And the third general point is that all of these effects are not categorical. They're scaled to the degree of bilingualism. So more bilingualism promotes more of this reorganization. And in that sense, being bilingual has consequences for both brain structure and brain function. I'll talk about that a little bit. And clearly consequences for behavior, but not just verbal behavior. The most dramatic consequences are seen in nonverbal behavior, where the executive control system is needed. Okay. I'm going to start by taking a closer look at vocabulary, and I'm going to use this as a proxy for what I said earlier was the bilingual problem with linguistic processing and lexical representations. So here's a graph from a study that we published in 2010. This is a distribution of scores on the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, which is a standardized receptive vocabulary test. The scores are all normed on a population mean of 100 with a standard deviation of 15. What we have along the x-axis is the score, and these are frequencies. So how many people scored 50 to 59, how many people scored 70 to 79, and so forth. So there's simply frequency distributions from a sample of, oh, isn't that interesting? I didn't put the sample size there. Oh, there it is. Okay, so there's over 1,700 kids altogether, okay? So the first thing you'll notice is that it's essentially two normal distributions, and that's pretty good, because any trait that you measure should distribute normally in a population, and it does. Now, I want to use this graph to evaluate the sentence, the claim that I made a few moments ago, that bilinguals have a smaller vocabulary than monolinguals in each language. Is that a true statement? Now, here's data from a very large sample. And what you can see is that each of these separate distributions is normally distributed with a mean slightly shifted from the population mean of 100. Now, when you do any kind of statistical analysis on this, the monolingual mean and the bilingual mean are wildly different from each other, in part because it's such a large sample size, it's a very sensitive model. So you could say statistically, monolinguals have a higher vocabulary than bilinguals. But is that a fair statement? If you look here, those are the monolinguals for whom that sentence is true. Those monolinguals indeed have a higher vocabulary score than any of the bilinguals in the sample. And those are the bilinguals for which the opposite is true. And the vast majority are in the middle. Now, what does that mean? Let's suppose you do a study and you sample 25 monolinguals and 25 bilinguals. You could choose monolinguals that happen to line up there and bilinguals that happen to line up there. And in your sample of 50 participants, it would be true that monolinguals have a higher vocabulary than bilinguals. But because we're dealing in the green zone, you could equally select two samples that looked like that. This is all consistent with those graphs. So what you have to be very vigilant about is understanding that statements about populations are not statements about individuals. So although it is true that on average through a population, monolinguals score higher than bilinguals on vocabulary tests, it is not equally true that monolinguals necessarily have larger vocabularies. That point will come back later, and it's something that often gets glossed over in research. Okay, but now we move to the executive control system. So there's the language representation. Executive control is a set of processes. It's not one thing. They're all in the front part of the brain. They all interact. They all have slightly different functions. And their tasks basically are inhibition, shifting, and working memory. That's the main kind of things that they do. They're located in the frontal lobes. They are the most important cognitive processes we have, by far, by far. They're also the very last processes to develop in childhood and the first processes to decline with aging, largely because of the myelinization of the frontal lobes. It's the last region to myelinate, and it's the first region for which myelin begins to decay. It's also the kind of evolutionarily newest brain region. And this fits the pattern of late evolutionary developments being late in phylogenetic development and early to decline. So it's a uniquely human, late developing, highly fragile, crucially important set of cognitive processes. Well, should we be worried about the decline of executive control? Okay, well, I've said already that this is the system that manages attention to language. All right, I actually have some examples to explain the components. All right, I mentioned that there's three main components, and the first one is inhibition and selection. So you go into a bar and you've got to find Betty, and she's somewhere and she's wearing a flowered dress, but everybody's wearing a flowered dress today. How are you going to find Betty? You have to go into a situation like this where you're bombarded with stimuli, with some ability to focus attention, not get distracted, and then eventually select the target. That's an executive process. The second important feature of this system is shifting and multitasking, and that's kind of what he's trying to do. And the third one is working memory. Just hold things in mind, move them around, try to remember where you started, and manipulate information. So that's the executive control system. And it develops and declines across the lifespan. So what we've shown within our research is that at all stages of the lifespan, we can see differences in the executive control system. We use tasks that are based on perceptual conflict, multitasking, inhibition, and shifting. I put examples here to refer back to the definitions I gave you a minute ago. So tasks based on all of these components of the executive function system, by and large, are performed better by bilinguals. There's some research, not mine, showing 7-month-old babies with better visual attention, and at all the other ages, many labs have contributed, and we've done research with all of those groups. So that's the pattern. The story is that these enhancements occur as a function of practice, because that executive control system gets tied into language processing. Every time you use language or hear language, you are recruiting this system, and it is fortified. It's also the case that as bilinguals perform these tasks, they do so in slightly different ways. They use slightly different brain networks. So their performance is often, not always, measurably better, but what's consistent is that it is qualitatively different. It's based on slightly different wirings in the brain. Now, I'm going to show you on this slide just one task that we've used with different age groups to give you a sense of what this looks like. This is a Simon task. You see a patch of red or green that appears on the left or right side of the screen, and you're given a rule. If you see a red square, press the left button. If you see a green square, press the right button. So if the red square appears on the left, that's easy because you're drawn to these flashing perceptual stimuli and you want to use a same hand response. If a green square appears on the left, you have to resist that very automatic association and overrule it with the correct response. So for children, young adults, and older adults, we can plot how long it takes them to select the key press for congruent, the easy, or incongruent trials. So these are reaction times, so higher scores are slower, poorer performance. Monolinguals in red and bilinguals in blue. And you see the pattern is always the same throughout the lifespan. So on all of these trials, bilinguals are performing faster. They're able to shift between the trials, they're better able to inhibit the irrelevant information, they're better able to hold the rule in mind. Everything that's involved in that task is slightly more efficient for bilinguals at all of these three lifespan snapshots. Now, the kind of gold standard for executive control is a Stroop task, and so I thought you should earn your dinner here a little bit, and you should do a Stroop task because it's really dull just sitting there and being an audience, right? So you know the rule, right? All you have to do is name the color of the font. Don't read the word. Name the color of the font. And you're all going to do this out loud, very loud, as fast as you can. Don't cheat, okay? You got to see what it feels like. So I'm going to show you these words. Ignore the word. Tell me the color of the font out loud as fast as you can.
Red, blue, green, red, green, blue.
You see? You thought you were so clever, huh? Okay. It's hard. And why is it hard? Because you're bombarded with two pieces of information, each of which leads to a different response, and that's conflict. And you don't know which, you have to resolve that conflict. That's what the executive control system does. And it's what it does every time a French-English bilingual sees a dog and chien emerges somewhere deep in the brain. It's the executive control system that manages that conflict. Okay? So we do this task, we give it to monolingual and bilingual participants, and we can look at how much extra time it takes them to do the more difficult incongruent items. And we've done this in 2 published studies anyway. So here's how to read these graphs. Whoops. Okay. All right. Two different studies. What I'm plotting here is this. In this study, we plotted how much more time does every individual need to do the hard items compared to their own speed for the easy items. And for reasons I could never recreate in this study, we calculated the proportion of extra time. There were different studies, so anyway. But you'll see the patterns are the same. Young adults are the solid bars. Red is monolinguals. So again, the monolinguals have more difficulty saying red when the word is green. And these are older adults who are slower all around, but the pattern is identical. So this is how executive control comes into play on a task that presents conflict, and how bilinguals on the same task actually are more efficient. I mentioned before that the brain bases are different as well. So I've just thrown in this one slide here to show you what I mean. This is a study. The lead author is a former student of mine, Gigi Look. And she had a small group, but very carefully matched group of monolinguals and bilinguals. They're all about 20 years old, who were carefully matched on cognitive, language, all kinds of measures. So they were very, very similar, except that one group was actively bilingual. They performed a flanker task. Flanker task is, I just realized I don't have a picture of it. You see a line of five arrows. And you are required to press a button on one side of the screen to show which direction the central arrow is pointing. But there are two irrelevant arrows between that are either all pointing in the same direction as that central arrow or in the opposite direction, creating conflict. So like the Stroop task, you get congruent and incongruent trials. Congruent trials are easy. Incongruent trials create a problem because you're pulled to the direction that these irrelevant flankers are leading you. So she gave this task to monolinguals and bilinguals. Oh, there, I do have a picture. Well, not so dumb. They're actually just arrowheads. And she moved it around a bit. So here's the relevant conditions. This is a congruent trial. They're told, press the key on the side of the screen to show which way the red arrowhead is pointing. So that would be a congruent trial, and that's an incongruent trial because everything else is leading to the other side. All right, now they did this in fMRI. So what we're going to look at is fMRI data, but it's not the usual kind of fMRI data. This is an analysis of the whole brain. The way this analysis works is you just throw in the whole brain and this very fancy computer looks for correlations between certain configurations of firing networks and performance, and tries to find out what network is activated when performance is optimal. So what is the best possible network to perform that kind of trial? What you get is a picture of the network, which is actually irrelevant for our purposes. It just shows you this bits, this bits, this bits, but it's all a network. It's not little regions. What's important is this. These are correlations. So the correlation between activation of that network for each of the groups doing each of the trial types. On the easy congruent trials, monolinguals and bilinguals, light green and dark green, do exactly the same thing. Their brains look the same. These are really easy trials. Everything leads you to the right, you press the right button. So this is a correlation. Up and down is it's arbitrary. You can just flip this and it all goes the other way. These are pretty strong correlations, or 0.8, which is very high, between doing well on the congruent items and having your brain look something like that. On incongruent trials, where there's conflict and it's harder and slower, now the groups are doing different things. So the monolinguals continue to use this same configuration, but the bilinguals do something completely different. This doesn't tell us what they're doing, it only tells us they aren't doing this. So that's the kind of evidence we can bring to bear on a claim like the functional organization, the way the executive system performs that task is different for bilinguals. And I would suggest that it's different because it is gradually changed over time as this executive control system has for years and decades been involved in monitoring language conflict. It becomes a different system. And so now let's go back to the main point. What about children? The study I'm going to show you now deals with two topics that I want to emphasize. One is how these systems work for children, and second, how they work when you're in that middle gray area where you're neither monolingual nor bilingual. If what I'm saying is true, if the executive control system is changing because of bilingualism, because through use for language management it is changed, then we should be able to see increased change with emerging bilingualism. That would be a logical implication of my argument. So in this study, it's actually two studies. We use continuous estimates of bilingualism as well as other factors. So we had no groups that we called monolingual or bilingual. There's two different studies. They were conducted independently for different purposes, and we only saw the commonality after the fact. Both of these studies were conducted on children who were in immersion education programs. These are very popular in Canada. I know there are pockets of acceptance here, but they're wildly popular in Canada. So an English-speaking community will send their children to a school where only French is used as the language of instruction, for example, even though there's no French spoken in the home or the community. In study one, we had children who were in a Hebrew day school program. They spoke English at home. Instruction was in Hebrew. In study two, these are children who were in a French program. This is actually a private French school, not a French immersion program. Now, because these studies were done independently, the measures we used in each study were different. So you're going to see the results of different tasks. But what's the same is that in both studies, all children were scaled for their degree of bilingualism and other factors, and all children completed a metalinguistic task and an executive control task, but different tasks. The data were analyzed by regression models, so we wanted to see what's predicting performance on the executive control task and on the regression task. And so the regression model was designed to first take care of things that we wanted to get rid of. So age, because the children spanned a 2 or 3 year age range. So first you put in age and you make sure that's not part of the variance you're looking at. Then we had two measures that we call sort of intelligence. A nonverbal intelligence test and an English vocabulary test, which is a measure sort of a verbal IQ. So these are basically how smart you are measures, if that's probably totally politically incorrect, but forgive me. And the third two measures, one is how bilingual they were. So because in each study they spoke English at home, we could get a comparable score for their other language, French or Hebrew, and the ratio of those two scores told us how bilingual they were. So if they scored identically on both the English and the other language test, they're perfectly bilingual and the ratio would be 1. And so deviations from there tells us how bilingual they are. And the other measure is how much time in months they've spent in the program. These kids come and go in these programs. So even though all the kids might have been in grade 3, some of the kids may have just arrived in grade 2, for example. So these two variables that I put in green are ways of measuring kind of how bilingual they are. Okay, here's what we found. First, let's look at the metalinguistic task. In study 1, it was this morphological awareness task. And as always, most of the variance is unexplained. That's age. And the big chunk of red, and that's a lot for something like this. A quarter of the variance is explained by what I'm calling how smart they are. You know, how verbal they are and how good their IQ is. Study 2, they did a completely different metalinguistic task. It's a grammaticality judgment task. And again, just now it's about 35% of the variance is explained by the same factor. So different kids, different tasks, very similar pictures. Now these kids also did an executive control task. It was a flanker task. You've now just seen a flanker task. So these are the same kids, but now look, being smart has nothing to do with how well they're doing on the flanker task. Now we have a big chunk of green. How bilingual they are. The more bilingual they are, the better they're doing on the flanker task. And to complete the picture, in study 2, again, these kids did a completely different executive control task, but the pattern is the same. So that's a pretty compelling similarity across the two tasks where the two studies, where the kids are different and the tasks are different, show that more language proficiency leads to better metalinguistic awareness. That's not surprising. And more bilingual experience leads to more executive control. That's the main point, okay? Some people have argued that the research has a problem because bilinguals are not the same as monolinguals in other ways. And for reasons that I've never totally understood, SES, socioeconomic status, is always mentioned. Honestly, I don't know why it is, but it is. I know how to do research, but anyway. So I have two studies to show you where we examine this. So the argument is that bilingualism and SES in a natural population are confounded, and so the effects that we report for bilingualism are more properly attributed to differences in SES. So the first of the two studies, this was done by a former postdoc of mine, Pascale Engel de Abreu. She's from Luxembourg. She did a study in Luxembourg and Portugal where she investigated only very, very poor children. So the way SES is controlled in Pascale's study is by holding constant a really, really narrow band of very disadvantaged children, and then looking to see if bilingualism emerges as something that can explain performance within this highly controlled SES environment. She had 40 children, 40 Portuguese Luxembourgish children in Luxembourg, but interesting, these 40 Portuguese monolingual children live in the same province from which all of these families emigrated. They came from the same very poor northern region of Portugal. She matched them on a gazillion thing, and I use gazillion as a technical term. It's kind of staggering how many things were identical about these two groups. Okay, here's just a vocabulary comparison. These are the bilinguals. The green lines here are their vocabulary scores in Portuguese. Now notice that the Portuguese Luxembourgish bilingual children have a lower vocabulary than Portuguese monolingual children, just like you've seen before. That's exactly consistent with that big normal curve distribution I showed you. This is their Luxembourgish vocabulary. They're not great, but they are attending school where all instruction is in Luxembourgish. Okay, she gave them a bunch of tests. Fluid intelligence test using a Raven's matrix. You have to figure out what piece. I'm going to go through this quickly. A visual memory test. You see something like that or something like that, and then you have to remember which of the cells had the odd shape. It's simple memory. There's no executive control. It's not even working memory. Very simple. Another example, you see dots, and then you have to remember where they were. It's just simple visual memory. And then two different executive control tasks. Fish flanker, you have to feed the middle fish by pressing the button showing where he's facing. And sky search, these things buzz along the screen and there's distractions and you have to find target shapes and so on. It's high executive control. Those are the tests. Okay, so you throw all of those scores into a factor analysis to see what is like the other. One of these things is not, that stuff. Okay, so here's what you get. The factor analysis goes through this battery and says, well, these things are kind of the same, and they're not at all like these things. And these things are the same, and they're not at all like these things. When a factor structure is so clear, you can name the factors. So we're calling that one representation and that one control, because here we're talking about the two executive control tasks, and here we're talking about knowledge, okay? So you can reduce the data and get a factor score for each kid. So that's what we do. These are factor scores for monolingual and bilingual children on each of these two factors. And then you can compare them. So on the representation factor, there's no difference. All the children are performing statistically equivalently. And on the control factor, the bilingual children are performing significantly better. Now look what this means. These are children with no advantages at all. These children are not only in poverty, they're living lives filled with all sorts of challenges of immigration, family structure issues and so forth. And although they're identical on everything, the bilingual children are doing better on the executive control tasks. So there's no role for SES in explaining that advantage. So for the second study looking at SES, we took a different approach. This time, we chose to examine two levels of SES and compare monolingual and bilingual children. I'm calling these first two working class and these middle class. But the remarkable thing about the data in this study is that the difference between the working class and the middle class children is trivially small. It's based primarily on parents' education. These children all live in similar neighborhoods. In fact, they go to the same schools. We had schools in this study that contributed to 3 different cells. So middle class and working class is not a neighborhood difference. It's nothing visible. It's only a difference in level of stimulation in the home environment as determined by parents' education. And we had monolingual and bilingual kids in each. They're matched on everything we could match. So this is a very subtle manipulation. Can we find effects of bilingualism, or are they confounded here with SES? If so, there would be no differences for bilingualism, and all group differences should be explained by SES. That's the argument. All right, so now I'll go through this quickly. We gave them cognitive ability and reasoning tests and that. And there's no effect. All the kids are identical. No SES differences and no bilingualism differences. All the kids are just as smart as each other. Language ability, we gave them a PPVT, and now we have middle class kids getting significantly higher scores than working class kids. They're sitting in the same classrooms. This is a home influence thing. And monolingual kids, again, with higher vocabulary than bilingual kids. Executive control. We gave them this task. I'm not going to take the time to explain it, a few tasks. And here, again, middle class kids are performing better than working class kids. And now this flips. Bilingual children are performing better than monolingual children. So here's the graph. The important thing is that these are both relevant factors in children's development, but they're independent. Research showing bilingual advantages in executive control is not confounded with SES. It's measuring something different. So if we start with language tasks, the monolingual working class and middle class kids both have higher language scores than bilingual working class or middle class kids. And for EF tasks, bilingual working class and middle class kids both have higher scores than monolingual working class or middle class kids. These are independent effects. So from those two studies, we conclude that SES is, of course, a hugely important factor in children's development and in children's development of executive control, but it does not interact with bilingualism. It's independent of it. And why does this matter for aging? Because executive control, as I mentioned earlier, declines with age, and it's the most important cognitive system we have. And you're not going to sit around and wait till you're 80 before it declines. It declines at 30. You're all over it. Okay. A little sobering thought. We have this crucial system for a very short time. Now, this doesn't mean it crashes and burns right away. It means there's a steady decline from middle age through adulthood, through older adulthood. So everything becomes more effortful. Now, I didn't really show you much, and this is the last main point I want to talk about. I didn't really show you much about the research we've done with aging, except for I had one slide up with older adults doing the Simon task. But all of that research is based on healthy aging, people who are cognitively aging in a normal, healthy way, so they're getting slower and things are more effortful, but they are not cognitively impaired. What happens when cognitive aging is not normal? Does bilingualism continue to play some kind of protective role? Now, it's a bit of an odd question because the primary symptom of dementia is a memory failure. And I haven't told you anything about bilingualism and memory. There's a bit of mixed evidence, but nothing very compelling. Everything I've told you is that bilingualism improves executive control, which is the front part of your brain. Memory is in the middle part, the medial temporal lobe, and Alzheimer's disease hits there first. Why would bilingualism have anything to do with a neurodegenerative disease that affects memory in the middle of the brain? Well, undaunted, we thought we'd ask. So the first two studies I'm going to show you were done by examining clinic records of patients who came to the Baycrest Center and were diagnosed with dementia by the team of neurologists. Toronto is a massively diverse city. About 60% of families in Toronto do not speak English at home. And the number of languages they speak is staggering. So this is a very, very diverse community. So you just dip into the general population and you're going to get bilingualism without even trying. In fact, getting monolinguals is sometimes the challenge. So we examined the clinic records of patients. In study one, 2/3 of them actually were diagnosed with Alzheimer's and the other 1/3 with other dementias. And so there were just under 100 in each of the two groups. They'd all waited about 3.5 years between noticing symptoms and coming to the clinic, so that's the same. Monolinguals have more formal education. That should protect them. That should mean monolinguals show symptoms of dementia at a later age. They score the same on this broad brush cognitive task. How old are they? The monolinguals are significantly younger. So the bilinguals are about 4.5 years older when symptoms of dementia are noticed. We repeated the study a few years later with a new sample from the same clinic. This time, all the patients had been diagnosed with probable AD, and things line up pretty similarly. And so this time, we find similar results. So altogether, there's about 400 patients in these two studies, and bilinguals are showing symptoms of dementia later. How can this be? Now, there's two arguments in the field about how this kind of protection takes place. It's called cognitive reserve. One argument, which is sometimes called brain reserve, is that your brain is actually fortified. It's like your brain is inoculated against these neurodegenerative diseases. So you have a better brain and you can ward off the disease. So the reason bilinguals would show these symptoms at a later age under this explanation is that their brains actually repel the disease. Alzheimer's disease happens when these neurofibrillary tangles embed themselves in the medial temporal lobe. So on brain reserve, the argument would be that a better brain resists them. The alternative is that the brains are the same, and in fact, the bilinguals might even have more disease. But because they have this secret cache of executive control, they can use that even for situations that, healthy older adults wouldn't use those areas to boost performance. It's compensation. So their medial temporal lobe is crumbling, but they recruit these more fortified frontal processes, the executive control system, to compensate for failing behavior, okay? And it's not so crazy because if a problem becomes too hard, you think, I have to think more carefully, more effortfully. If you concentrate more, you achieve more. So that would be the sort of argument that a simple memory task, like I have to go to the store to buy milk, which would not normally call in the executive control system, when that executive control system is more fortified, more used to being recruited, it comes in and boosts behavior. So that's the compensation view. So these are the two possibilities. Are the bilinguals older because they have better brains that can repel the disease, or are they older because they compensate for the disease, in which case the disease is there? So on this view, you'd have to say, well, they have it, but they haven't shown evidence of it because they're patching it up, okay? So here's what we did. We looked at 20 monolinguals and 20 bilinguals, matched again as carefully as we could, all with a diagnosis of probable AD. And we got CT scans from them, okay? Now, point number one, another really depressing thing about getting old, if that isn't in and of itself depressing enough, is that your brain shrinks. So there's a certain amount of measurable brain atrophy that is age-related. For that reason, it was very important that all the participants in this study were the same chronological age. So we measured whole brain volumes, and they're the same. So in sense of age-related normal brain atrophy, there's no difference. Now, I said earlier that the way Alzheimer's disease begins is right here. This is the hippocampus right here. These plaques and tangles begin to deposit in this region. This is the memory center. And they muck up all of that tissue. And that's why memory becomes a problem, because it's interrupting all of the memory circuits and centers. And because these are CT scans, the way it shows the presence of plaques and tangles is through black holes or atrophy, because these plaques aren't imageable. So what they do is they're replacing the gray matter, which is imageable, with black stuff, which is atrophy, okay? So clinically, CT scans can be used and are used to determine how much Alzheimer's disease a person has. You simply measure some of these points in the medial temporal lobe, and more atrophy signifies more Alzheimer's disease, okay? So here we go. So these 20 monolinguals, 20 bilinguals, they all go into the neurologist's office and they all look identical. They're the same age, the same cognitive level, their memory scores are identical. There's no way of telling them apart. And so now we look at measures of their medial temporal lobe, and there's 3 specific AD measures. Temporal horn, the bilinguals have significantly more atrophy. The ratio of the temporal horn, again, and the third ventricle. So these are 3 measures used to clinically assess degree of Alzheimer's, and the bilinguals on all 3 had significantly more disease, and they functioned the same. So our conclusion is they're compensating. There's nothing here to suggest they have warded off the disease, repelled the disease, resisted the disease. they have the disease, and they have more of the disease than the monolinguals. So they're compensating. And this last slide is kind of a summary of why these differences that I'll go through quickly, because it's a bit, I'm trying to bring the brain data into our story about why this happens. So 3 points. Point number 1, constant need to manage attention and language processing recruits the EC network. Okay, I've said that several times. But how do we know it's true? I've chosen this one study, again, Gigi, look, did a meta-analysis of 10 fMRI studies in the literature. All 10 studies involved bilingual subjects, only bilinguals, doing a task in which they had to switch between languages. So either naming digits, if they're in red, you name them in one language, if they're blue in another, or naming pictures, if it has a box around it, you name in one, that sort of thing. So 10 studies with bilinguals, all of that type. And she looked at the areas of activation that came up at the point they had to switch, stop naming them in English, start naming in Spanish. Those switch points where attention is required. And the meta-analysis showed this network. Those are the areas that were engaged when people switched between languages. Simple word naming, but switching between languages. And the remarkable thing is, that's the executive control network. It just is. So you look into studies of what brain regions control attention to perceptual distraction, that's the region. So that's evidence that, for the claim that bilinguals are indeed recruiting that executive control network all the time. Point number 2, the conflict that the use of this executive control network for both verbal and nonverbal tasks reorganizes that network. And here I'm just showing you the same slide I showed you before to keep it simple. There's other studies, but this one is simple. So you saw that on the difficult incongruent trials, bilinguals are no longer using the same configuration as monolinguals. And the third point is that this reconfigured network is more efficient. And efficiency, this is a new idea in this literature, but efficiency is now being described as being able to perform the task with less activation. You don't have to turn up the crank as high to get the same level of performance. There's a few studies that have shown that, but the one I've chosen to show you is from Brian Gold and his group. And these are monolinguals and bilinguals. I'll just point to the relevant pictures. Here, left, this is a good one. Left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, monolinguals and bilinguals. This is how activated the monolinguals raise that region and the bilinguals raise that region when performing, this is a little switching task. So the monolinguals need to turn up the energy a lot higher. And this is a correlation between how much activation there is and how good performance is. And these are reaction times, so lower is better. The less activation, the better the performance. And that's a pretty strong correlation. So the bilinguals can get away with less activation, and this is part of the reason they have better performance. So that's the story that we're working on to explain this array of findings. So the primary effect of bilingualism is through this cumulative practice. It's this intense experience that has the effect of changing that fundamental executive control network. And this, I believe, is powerful evidence for neuroplasticity. The experience of using language in a certain way over a lifetime reconfigures this crucial cognitive network. and everything you practice is good for you. Those are some of the people in my lab who actually did all the work, and my funding agencies, and I thank you.
That was fascinating. I think what we'll do is people are probably eager to head off campus or come to our reception, but I'd like to do, let's do 2 burning questions.
I have a really burning question. Does it matter when the L2 is acquired, or at what point you consider somebody being bilingual?
Well, you have to go back to that first slide where it's all slithering along a continuum. So more is better, earlier is better, better is better, more better is better. It's cumulative. So it's because it's experience-based. If you want to perform a piano concerto in Carnegie Hall, you're going to want to be practicing a lot. And the more you practice, the better you'll get. So this is no different from anything else.
So even if it's acquired later in life?
Well, yes, absolutely, and not because it's going to make you bilingual. So the key to all of this is the idea that stimulating, engaging mental activity is good for your brain. Bilingualism happens to be naturally stimulating and engaging. So if you're an older adult and you're monolingual and you want to think of something to do that's going to save your brain, there aren't many things that are harder, more stimulating, and more engaging than trying to learn a language. So the process of trying to learn a new language, especially later in life, is doing all of the work. Even though you may never reach a level of fluency that you're satisfied with or that would get you the label of bilingual, it's the process of trying to use your mind in those ways.
It still alters the brain, though, the way the processes?
Because it's cumulative. So, we have some data where we looked at, not older adults, but we looked at kids in first-year Spanish. So we took kids who had never taken Spanish before, were monolingual, and enrolled in Spanish, which in our university is a 2-semester course. So we tested them in September and then in April, okay, using ERP measures of brain function while they were performing some executive control tasks. I have to tell you that after a year of introductory Spanish, their Spanish was appalling. It was really awful. And yet, we started to see differences. We compared them to a similar cohort who were not taking introductory Spanish, they were taking introductory psychology. That was our control group. And in the Spanish group, even under those minimalist conditions, we could see the certain configurations beginning to change in the brain.
One more burning question. John?
This is a question about sort of the age, or the age at which bilingualism has its onset. My area is sort of more about subdomains of language. So I realize the analyses you presented aren't mostly sort of correlational with language-specific components of language tasks, but do you have work that you didn't present that maybe talk about how semantics, pragmatics, syntax, morphology, depending on the subdomain of language, you find a stronger association with executive control?
That's interesting. That's a very interesting question. I think what you're asking is, are some aspects of language proficiency or language use more driving than others? And I have not thought about it. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know. We tend to use vocabulary because it's easy to measure and it's obvious.
And it didn't seem to have a big connection, right? Vocabulary, right?
Oh, no, on the contrary. The more bilingual you are, as measured by, vocabulary size, and we use lots of different measures of vocabulary. We use expressive and productive and receptive, all sorts of stuff. The more bilingual you are, the better these outcomes. We do have those data.
So to your
just let me just say one thing. This doesn't answer your question. Your question is more interesting than this, but we do have at least one study with children where we got 2 studies with children where we also got measures of grammatical knowledge of English, and the results seem to follow along with the vocabulary.
Okay, so to your knowledge, like studies that were specifically syntax, specifically morphology, that hasn't been done so much.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, one more eager hand raiser.
You've used bilingualism as the term, and I'm fine with that. But at the same time, I'm wondering about diglossia and multilingualism.
Yeah.
Diglossia you could sort of define as multilingual or bilingualism light, the difference between Swiss German and Standard German, for example. And then with multilingualism, the term self-evident. And I'm just wondering if either of those phenomena add any interesting dimensions to what you're doing.
It's all interesting and it's a mess. So just a couple of comments, but no answers, okay? So let's look at dialect differences first. Now, there's clear cases where dialects are languages, that it's just really, really a political thing. And then you can say, all right, so somebody who speaks Mandarin and Cantonese, that's bilingual. They're different enough, okay? German and Swiss German, well, what are you going to do with that? And then I think, well, you know, Spanish and Catalan, they're not all that different.
Watch it.
They're hugely different. But this is the problem. I mean, I don't know. And then, you know, we get the related question is, are the effects greater when the two languages are similar or diverse? And there is a group of people who will argue with enormous passion that if the two languages are very diverse, then it engages much more executive control because you have to switch over a larger distance and you have to change, you get no benefit. So much bigger benefit if the languages are different. And another group of people who argue with equal passion and equally no evidence that if the languages are very similar, that clearly needs more executive control because there's more confusion and there's more okay. There's no evidence. Any study that we've done, what we've done basically is take subsets of data. We haven't collected data particularly for those purposes. But when we disaggregate our sample according to the other language, we've never found anything that shows one or the other. But the other part of your question is about the addition of more languages, and here again, it's a mess. So there are a couple of studies that suggest added benefit from more languages. We're doing a couple of studies in our lab now looking at bilingualism versus trilingualism. But if you take all the mess that I tried to show you about bilingualism on that first slide with the dimension, trilingualism raises the stakes by an order of magnitude because the third language has such a variable relationship. So we were giving these questionnaires to subjects who come into our lab. So for bilinguals, if you want to say, okay, out of, give us your rating out of 10 for each of your languages. So a bilingual will say, well, my first language is a 10, my second language is 9.5 or 10. And if you ask trilinguals, the third language can be anything. It can be 8, it can be 2, it can be 4. It's really hard. And the social circumstances surrounding trilingualism are different. Final point on trilingualism. I think it's a question that can't easily be examined for the following reason. To a great extent, when we study bilingualism in the population we use, which is people living normal lives in this highly diverse society, they speak one language at home, another language in the community, it's all very seamless, and both languages are supported. There's lots of positive affect and social support for non-English languages in Toronto, at least. I don't know about anywhere else. So all these cases leads to a situation where by and large, I can assume that aside from the number of languages these people are speaking, these are the same people. Like I showed you in the study of SCS in schools, these kids are sitting in the same classrooms, listening to the same teachers. So for bilingualism, we can make a certain level of assumption that life has made them bilingual for whatever reason, but aside from that, they're the same, they're all as smart as each other, they're all as motivated, they're the same, so we can compare. I think trilingualism and polylingualism beyond that introduce another factor, and that is talent, motivation, seeking opportunities. At some point, people endeavor to learn languages, and they usually do that because they're good at it or they have an ability or a talent. So now we're looking at a group of people who learn to speak 3 or maybe 4 languages who may not be the same people in all other dimensions as our monolinguals or even our bilinguals. So I think it's a difficult question, and the evidence so far is thin but mixed.
Let me, great questions. What we're going to do is continue the conversation in a different context. We'll go next door. People can hang out, interact with each other. Pin Ellen down for your further questions. And so I invite you to come on over, and thank you so much for coming out today. One more.